all black everything, all black, you know, all black in the name of all my black heroes, all black everything, all black polos, all black medallions, yeah, all black, yo.
It's authentic to mine, so. All right, well. And am I inscribing this to you?
Yes.
There we go.
Welcome this evening to Rofhiwa Books. First off, I want to thank Neal and Beverly for opening up their space for the event tonight. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Rofhiwa is the only independent black-owned bookstore in the city of Durham. It's actually black queer-owned, and it's been a wonderful, hospitable space here in East Durham for 2 years since they opened their doors. So if you have a chance to come back through with your extensive collection of black literature, including children's literature, please feel free to come through. The series is called Small Talk at Rofhiwa, and it's a gesture towards Gil Scott-Heron, whose very first album was called Small Talk at 125th Street. So in the spirit of that kind of intimate space, we've recreated that, or tried to, here in Durham. It is a series that is sponsored by Left of Black, which is a video podcast now in its 13th season, produced now by Eric Barstow, who you will see working behind the cameras, along with a member of his team. And we wanted to do something to bring Left of Black from out of the studio and Zoom and into the community. So that's what we're attempting to do with this series. Tonight, we're joined by Chantal James, the author of None But the Righteous. The Los Angeles Times Rights of None But the Righteous. This is a book of faith, aching to be claimed, of a land that dares to be redeemed, of souls searching to be free, of all spirits looking for a home. Kirkus writes, a mesmerizing story told by an impressive and captivating voice. And then finally, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution writes, None But the Righteous emerges as a provocative and compelling examination of the human spirit that ties the bind people to each other and the way people are shaped by the things that happen to them far more than the choices they make. How are you doing tonight?
Oh man, I'm doing great because I love being in North Carolina. And nothing could be finer than to be in Carolina in the springtime.
Well, thanks for joining us.
Yes, thank you, and I consider it a huge, huge honor. So thank you for your openness.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So let's start with the title, because when I got a copy of the book, knew it was coming out, and I saw the title was None But the Righteous, the first thing I heard in my head was the Mighty Clouds of Joy singing None But the Righteous. So talk a little bit about the title.
I would love to talk about the title because it means a lot to me. So as you are aware, None But the Righteous is a Negro spiritual that is so old that we didn't have to talk about getting the rights to it with my publisher because it's in the common domain.
Right.
And there are so many different covers of it, but I was listening to a version by Nina Simone when I was inspired to title my novel after it, and I thought this is a great church song. Mm-hmm. And as I approached looking at Hurricane Katrina metaphorically, I was really interested in looking at the waters as the power of baptism. Mm-hmm. And so for me, when I was listening to this Nina Simone song that I've heard other versions of, that there's so many recorded versions of, that people have been singing before recording existed, I thought, wow, how can I get this song in my book? And so there is a scene when a character is singing this song at church. And I was also thinking of the concept of righteousness. And so the main character, Ham's foster mother, Miss Pearl, is a very self-righteous individual. But I do think that over the course of the novel, it's kind of a coming-of-age story for him. And I feel like over the course of the novel, he comes to his own maybe morally ambiguous idea of what it means to be righteous. And so he comes to have this idea that he himself is on this personal journey to gather righteous people to him. And so those were the kinds of things that were important for me to think of in titling the book. And so the full lyric is none but the righteous shall be baptized. And so that is very important to me, because when we think about any traumatic thing that we go through, we don't know why we go through things that are difficult, but we justify it to ourselves in certain ways by saying God is testing us because we're righteous. And so those are some of my considerations in choosing to title the novel.
This book is about Hamilton, the full name, as we find out later in the novel, about his journey or journeys, a journey that's going on beside him, literally, inside of him. What was your journey to this book?
My journey to this book, that's a big question. So I came to a journey through this book This book was a huge journey for me, because it was an 11-year process from my first sitting down to write the book to its publication. And one of my first ideas where I said, oh, this is a novel, was when I was with my mom at her parish in Raleigh, and they were having a tea to raise money for a statue of St. Martin de Porres. So I'm looking through the little booklet about his life and talking about his miraculous deeds, and he could be in two places at once, and he was healing the sick, and he was doing all this stuff because they have to have miracles attested to them to be saints. So I thought, wouldn't this be a sort of interesting kind of narrator who had these supernatural capabilities? And for me, I was also thinking of like the kind of figure in like Jimi Hendrix's Voodoo Child, who just like is like larger than life and just has these supernatural powers. So being drawn to St. Martin as this supernatural narrator who is above embodied life was definitely one of my main sparks. And then because I felt this was going to be a novel of Black Catholicism, it was important to me to locate it geographically in a place where Black Catholicism was important. And I spent most of my childhood in Raleigh, but my grandmother, who's one of the people the book is dedicated to, was from New Orleans, and she and my grandfather, who's from North Carolina, who's from Eastern North Carolina, Elizabeth City, actually met as students at Xavier University. And so now I'm lost my train of thought, but I thought I need this protagonist who has a strong relationship to New Orleans. When I thought New Orleans, keep in mind this being 11 or 12 years ago, Katrina was like right there.
Right.
So, this is a Katrina novel. How do I explore who this character is that I'm writing about? And those were kind of some of the ways that it congealed and solidified to come together for me. So I was working at a used bookstore. I mentioned to you briefly before the cameras started rolling that I worked for a bookseller. So I went to Spelman in Atlanta, and after I came back from my Fulbright, I worked for a bookseller for about 3 years. And he let me write in his annex where he would keep books to ship out. And so I started writing this novel working as a bookseller, my boss letting me use his annex as a writing space. And I finished the first draft. Didn't take me too long, few months, but my life exploded completely into complete bits and shards shortly thereafter. So I had a mental breakdown. I'm revising my my first draft at my parents' house in Raleigh, North Carolina, in their treehouse in their backyard.
Same treehouse I imagine you played in when you were.
Yes, exactly. And at the time, I wrote it in a lucid state of mind. My first revision, I had very strong delusions at the time, and I was not in the most lucid state of mind. But it was weird because when I would approach my art, I would just be like laser focused on the creative process, and I was just like tunnel vision. And everybody who was witness to me in those states know that I never stopped creating art, and I never stopped writing during that time. Yeah. That was never that was a part of the problem. But I'm in and out of losing my mind over the course of writing this book, and I do think that I got tugged into some darker spaces due to the spiritual work I was doing as part of my creative process, because one of the things I was into in this book was the syncretism between St. Martin de Porres and Papa Legba, New Orleans voodoo. Right. So I was making my offerings at the crossroads, and I do think that when you play with spirits, sometimes they tip you over to the other side. And I do think that messing with Legba kind of, you know how he does? Yeah. So he kind of took me to some places. But over the course of the journey, I got a new literary agent because my first literary agent, who was really into my first novel that I wrote in Morocco, totally didn't get None But the Righteous at all. Said, no, you need to chop this up, make it linear. I did everything I could to satisfy him, and he still wasn't satisfied. I found a new literary agent who was into it, and it was sent out to like 30 publishers. One said yes. and so I think as a writer, it's very easy to compare yourself to other people and say like, oh, well, this person had it so much easier than me and all of this stuff. And that is largely constructed by your mind. Yeah. But I know that it was certainly a long and interesting journey from the first conceptualization of the idea to this novel to it actually making it out into the world.
Yeah. You mentioned, going back 11 years ago, it's a Katrina novel. Katrina goes largely unnamed.
Yes, as does the city of New Orleans.
As is the city of New Orleans. And in that way, the idea of Katrina becomes almost a metaphor for all kinds of trauma that have black folks on the run, right, in exile in different kinds of ways. When you think about some of these characters, what was the trauma that they were dealing with?
Well, I think my characters have a lot of interesting different kinds of trauma. And even though this novel is not biographical in really any regard, my thing that I really strongly identify with is that I think is almost universal, that a lot of people identify with, is like just feeling that you don't belong. So I think Ham really struggled, and that's another thing that critics kind of picked up on. I think Ham is someone who's always struggled with feeling he doesn't belong. He was a foster kid, always the odd kid out in the household, always treated like the charity case. Then he gets this girl knocked up, and her family doesn't like him that much, and he doesn't really belong with them. And his friend Mayfly, I think, also deals with these questions of belonging. I think for Ham as a foster kid, who whose parents neglected him so badly that the state took him away. I mean, that's a very specific type of trauma.
Yeah.
And so that is certainly one of the ways that trauma is present. But I think there are smaller ways that trauma comes into play. And of course, being in exile from a storm is like a hugely traumatic thing. I think the character Deborah, who's the mother of his child, is someone who was born some interesting trauma, because she is the daughter of divorce. Her parents aren't together, and that has taken its toll on her. And I almost feel like in her family, she's taken on this kind of a mule relationship where, like, she's holding everybody together and very, very bound by her duty to the men in her life because she's the only girl. And so just off the top of my head, those are some of the ways trauma comes into play.
When you discuss Hamilton and foster care, you know, there's a scene in the book that stayed with me throughout the whole book. And it's a scene with he and his sister, right? And as you describe it, there's a point where he can't even remember his little sister's name, but yet there's this beautiful, tender moment with her. He wakes up, they're both hungry. The mom's not around to take care of them, and he instinctively pulls, you know, the potato out the refrigerator, cleans it in the toilet, right? Because he's a kid and he doesn't know any better, and knows that his sister can't chew the potato, raw potato, because she doesn't have any teeth. So he chews it for her, you know, just so that she could have some sustenance. And for me, that said a great deal to me about the kind of character that Ham was.
Yeah. I like that you say that, actually, because I feel one of the reasons I like Ham as a character is because, like, he's not necessarily a cut and dry hero.
Yeah.
He does some shady things over the course of his time, but I'm glad that you brought that to attention, because he does have this compassion in his heart, and he does care about people. And I do also think that part of your experience that you have when you feel like you're an outsider looking in who doesn't belong is that, like, you have all this love in your heart that you really want to give. And you're like, why won't people let me give the love that I have in my heart? Why don't they want that, you know?
When he brings Mayfly home, right, to Miss Pearl's house, right, that same kind of element of him having some sense of caring for somebody else. Let's talk about Miss Pearl for a moment.
Sure.
Right, she's an interesting figure. She brings him in because she needs money.
Exactly.
Right. She has her own son, right, and we see her working through how to treat them fairly, and Ham knowing that she can't, right? That's just not her, but not expecting her to either. As you mentioned earlier, right, she's self-righteous in the sense that she performs a certain kind of piety, right? And you mentioned in the novel, once she realizes the power of that performance over other folks, she kind of doubles down on it, right?
Yeah.
But yet, she's the figure that you get the sense of throughout the novel that Ham is most concerned with her survival in the aftermath.
Because
right?
he was most concerned with her acceptance, I think. And he was most concerned with, how do I get this person to love me? You know? And every crumb she gave him, he was so grateful for. And he always felt like, this is one person I can look to as sort of a parental figure that, like, I can feel attached to, and, like, I can feel like maybe they didn't give me 100%, but they gave me enough that I could work with, and so that's kind of the attachment that he has as somebody that he deeply cares about, whose fate after the storm he wonders about.
And when he first gets there, he runs away, and the trinket is given to him afterwards, right? And you know, I didn't grow up Catholic. Grew up in New York City, right? And a bunch of black kids went to Catholic schools who were never Catholic, right? They just
A lot of people were
right.
educated by Catholics
They just,
who were not Catholic.
you know, their parents weren't trying to send them to public school, saying them going to Catholic school,
Exactly.
right? And sometimes that was worse, but that's a whole other conversation.
Well, we're not going there today. We won't go there today, but that is its own conversation.
And so I'm about 25 pages into the book, and I'm like, who the hell is narrating this story, right? And that's it's Martin, right? And you know, the shreds of his body that are placed in these different parts, right? And it's in this trinket. So talk a little bit about the significance of this trinket.
Oh yeah, I would love to talk about that. So in Catholicism, it's a weird religion. So they are very concerned with these relics.
Right.
And a relic is an object that the holy person touched, an object the holy person owned, a part of the holy person's body.
Right.
That way it was their bones, their hair, their skin. And actually, as weird as this sounds, it's 100% fact that every single Catholic church in the altar has a relic of a saint that may indeed be a piece of a person's body who lived a long time ago. Okay. So I love Miss Pearl because she's an example of a very churchy type of black woman who dabbles in voodoo, even though she thinks she's too good for it, because her mother was a voodoo queen. Her mother earned a living as a conjurer. And she was trying to move away from that and say, no, I'm a pious, upright church woman. But when push comes to shove, and she needs to put some root work on somebody, she will resort to that. And so that is exactly what she did. She had one of her mother's old objects that she used as a conjure woman in the home she lived in that was her mother's. And she said, I can't get this boy to behave. I'm going to use magic to bind him to me so that he will behave. And in the course of that, she gives him this charmed object, which is in fact a piece of jewelry embedded with a piece of St. Martin de Porres' bone. And this is the means through which his whole relationship with the saint who was narrating this tale of his life started.
So I'm going to ask you a really, really traditional literary question.
Sure.
How much are we supposed to trust St. Martin as the narrator of this story?
Well, I don't think you are supposed to trust him, honestly, because he's a shady saint. And the thing about St. Martin, as far as being a character, is that like he is extremely motivated by the fact that he is no longer embodied and needs to use living people.
Visceral pleasure.
Exactly.
Right.
In order to continue his life. So that's why when Ham starts to throw him off, he's like, "Oh no, we're not doing this." You know what I mean? So I think that he's not a 100% straightforward, you need to trust everything that he says narrator, because he does have his own motivations and he has his own. I think St. Martin is actually in mourning for the life of his body throughout this book.
Yeah.
And I think he's in mourning because actually, if you think about it, and this is something I'm putting together right now, but in Catholic dogma, you know, a lot of the time Catholics won't even want to be cremated because your body's supposed to be whole so that when Jesus comes back, he can resurrect you and you can walk again at the second coming. Mm-hmm. So when you're one of the people who achieves the highest status in this religion and your body's being ripped apart, that's actually being taken from you in a sense. Yeah. So he mourns his physical integrity, I think, because of the fact that parts of him have been scattered to every part of the earth. And the way that comes out is not necessarily in a well-adjusted way, I don't think. I think it's a very grasping way that he deals with that.
How do you feel about describing a saint that way as a Catholic? I mean, you joked with me beforehand that, you're waiting to be excommunicated. Right?
Well, don't tell them, because I hope that doesn't happen. But I will say that, like when I look at the relationship that religion has in the world, and the force that religion is in the world, I have to say that my approach to it is as someone who understands that this is a real part of culture that forms people, but I am not necessarily lock in step with the hierarchical authority of any particular religion right now, So I am not necessarily... I approach this as a creative writer rather than as somebody who is a missionary of the faith or something. And I gave myself permission to manipulate these Christian ideas and things like that in ways that maybe somebody who was trying to spread the gospel would not do. But I hope that people would be able to have appreciation for what I did. Because I have an appreciation and a respect for it and a love for it, and that is why I wrote it.
Ham is barely an adult. Right? He's 19 years old.
He's 19
years old.
Just like is that Howlin' Wolf Muddy Waters song?
Mannish boy, yeah. And it's all of this life that's compacted, right, into these 19 years. Would you say that he is, in fact, a kind of metaphor for young black people in this moment?
That's interesting, because I don't see him as a stand-in for all young black people necessarily at all. But I do think that he is a manifestation of a phenomenon that applies broadly to a lot of young black men who are trying to find themselves. And a lot of what he deals with in the chips on his shoulder are things that a lot of young black men deal with. And I'm thinking right now of when he was learning to put I forget how I phrased it, but when he was learning to put his swagger on as he was leaving the house and starting to work for himself. And it's just his game face that he needs to show the world and things like that. And just some of the weight I think that young black men may feel as they're trying to become men and assume manhood, and all of the expectations that are placed on you as what you're supposed to be as a man and things like that. And I think that's compounded by the fact that he's becoming a father. So now he's thinking, well, what kind of a man do I have to be for my child? And what kind of a figure do I have to be for this young person who's coming into my life that I'm about to be responsible for?
He's with Deborah. He leaves, comes back to find out that she's with child. Did you always know, well, two things. Did you always know he was going to come back to her that first time? And did you always know he was going to come back to her in the end?
I would say that neither of those were surprises to me, because that's not the way I write. I plot things. But
and I ask that because it goes against every expectation of what we might think of the character, right? At least popular ideas about young black men.
Keep in mind that his first time he goes back to her, it's because he's trying to make his way back to New Orleans.
Right.
And he's retracing the route that he took to leave New Orleans. And he also doesn't feel that at home at his friend Mayfly's house. So he's like, well, I got to get out of here and find someplace else. So it's really having a place to stay that where he knows somebody cares about him, probably a little bit more than he cares about them, but enough to give him a roof over his head. That's the impetus for him to come back the first time.
Sure.
And then the second time, it's because he wants to see his child, and we're not going to say what happens, but
Right.
those are the reasons why he chooses to come back to her.
Yeah. I'm going to give you some words and ask you how you think about these words in the context of None But the Righteous. Home.
Elusive.
Why?
Well, Ham did not have a stable family situation, but he had a hometown. And that was the place he was from. And that was a big part of his identity, part of his dialect, part of his culture. And that place was destroyed. So he's trying to get back to something that doesn't even exist.
Right.
And he's trying to find homes among other people who don't completely accept him. And even the character Mayfly is, I think, someone whose home is elusive. So I think homes are elusive for people in this novel.
Love.
Binding.
Explain.
Well, I think that love in my novel is like, and it's not like the supreme example of like necessarily how God wants you to love that's portrayed in my novel, but there are strong bonds that people have, and there's very much a sense of what binds you to people, and how are you bound to people, and how will you finagle bonds if you don't feel like you have them. You know what I mean? So I think the way love occurs in my novel is very much as a binding force that people are searching for that's going to tie them to each other.
Faith.
This is a weird answer, but I would say culture. That's weird, but for me, faith is the cultural air these people breathe. And I think they do not necessarily have very articulate, spiritually philosophical ways of viewing the world, but they are embedded in their faith because it's so much a part of who they are and how they live.
How about freedom?
Well, the novel is really all about freedom. It's all about freedom. I mean, the narrator, St. Martin, wants to be free. He wants to be free to go to heaven. He can't be with Christ because he's supposedly got it good in with Christ. Right. You know, so, I mean, and I think Ham always wants this sense of freedom. He's always looking for freedom, and he's very much a rolling stone who's always searching for his freedom. Once he gets out of New Orleans, he's ready to roll, and part of the reason he doesn't stay with Deborah's family is because he feels so constricted there.
Yeah.
So he's searching for freedom, and that's what he starts to get a taste of when he's traveling with his friends, the migrant workers.
Right. What happens to St. Martin when he finally tosses the trinket?
Well, it's funny because since I've been back in town and I've talked to people I know who read the book, we actually just had this discussion, and they want me to tell them what happens after the end of the story, and they want me to write a sequel and all of this stuff. And I'm like, well, for me, I will entertain your question, but I will preface it by saying that for me, the book ends when it ends, and it has set, ideally, it has set something in the reader that their mind is going to work with and work on, and they're going to supply. I was trained in philosophy. My undergraduate at Spelman was in philosophy, and I also have a master's in philosophy. And when we talk about the ancient Greeks who stole everything from Egypt, but now I'm being tangential. When we talk about the ancient Greeks, all of Plato's dialogues end in aporia.
Right.
And I wanted my novel to end in aporia, which means that it ends in a question. So I would say that for me, as the kind of artist I am not concerned with what St. Martin is doing once that book ends, once we're at the end of the book and you shut the book. I'm not concerned with that. But to entertain your question, I will say, I believe St. Martin moves on to his next host.
Okay.
The next person who finds his trinket, all of the many other people who are in possession of parts of his body that he simultaneously has relationships with that this novel isn't about.
Okay. Okay. The book came out last year. Paperback came out this January. How have you felt about it being in the world?
That's an interesting question because you have to separate that question from like, how do I feel about my self-esteem as a writer, and how do I feel about as how successful I am as a writer? But that's not what you asked me.
You can answer those questions if you want to.
You asked me, how do I feel about this book being out in the world? And I think that I feel great about this book being out in the world because I wanted to communicate to people. That's why I wrote it. And I wanted to contribute to something. That's why I wrote it. And I got to meet writers and be considered the equal to writers who are my heroes because I wrote this book. That's pretty special. And I just got to live in the minds of lots of other people that I don't know, that I've never met because I wrote this book.
Yeah.
And that's really cool. So that's some of what it's felt like to have the book out in the world.
Talk a little bit about, though, how you lived or didn't live with these characters as you were developing them, right? What is that process like for you?
Well, they were with me all the time. And I think different writers write in different ways. And I have written in many different genres. And I can always pause what I'm doing to write something that's completely unrelated and not in the same discipline as what I'm working on. But I cannot work on, like, I'm not going to say never, but for me to be actively working on a novel, it's hard to do the two of those things at one time, even though I worked on another novel over the long period of time that this one wasn't being published. It's now completed, but that's a different story. But they were always with me. I was always thinking about these characters. They were with me all the time. I was thinking about them from the time I woke up to the time I went to bed. I was seeing things in my life that were reminding me of them. I was having those magical coincidences and occurrences that guided me to thinking of them. And I was very immersed in the story that I was telling as I was writing.
It's a story about a mythical New Orleans. You're from North Carolina. Why Alabama?
Well, it came because I looked on a map and I said, what's his escape route? And a lot of it came out of my research because I looked on a map. I looked on the map a lot when I wrote this book because I wanted to know what crops do they grow in Texas at this time of year when they're traveling to harvest crops.
Yeah.
And I had to do some research because I didn't know. And so I was thinking, I have cousins in Mobile, Alabama, and I was just thinking other parts of the Gulf region that were also affected by Katrina.
Right.
They didn't get the media attention.
And Mobile has like the biggest Mardi Gras party outside of New Orleans. Right?
Anybody from Mobile will make sure you are clear on that. but it was just as far as where it was situated geographically. And because I went to Spelman and lived in Atlanta for a long time, I did have my own touch points with Alabama because it's close enough to drive and I've been there. So I was like, I think I know enough about this place that I can write it. And certainly I can come to know more through research about it. And I just think it's gonna be part of the wave that this character makes his route out of Louisiana into Atlanta.
I'm a music person, as you know. Mm-hmm. What do you listen to when you write, or do you listen to music when you write?
I love listening to music in general, but when I write, it's difficult because I need sometimes not to have words, but sometimes I can listen to music with words. But like, I like a lot of soul, a lot of the classic soul, Aretha Franklin. I like a lot of psychedelic. I like a lot of black psychedelic stuff, like what Manny Riperton was doing with Rotary Connection.
That's a great reference.
And I'm a big fan of Jimi Hendrix. Huge fan of Jimi Hendrix. Could not be a bigger fan of Jimi Hendrix. And like I like jazz, like Sun Ra. I like really trippy music that takes my mind to a different place.
Okay.
That, like, there's some kind of music that is as good as doing drugs if you listen to it, and that's the kind of music that I like to listen to because it really takes your place to really takes your mind to a whole different place.
Probably healthier.
Yes, I mean it's healthier than drugs.
Before I open this up to the audience, when you were done with the book, what was the one thing that surprised you the most when you were done?
When I was done, well, I think it always surprises you. I can't say always because I can't speak for every single writer on earth, but it surprises me how I come to care about characters that I thought were a means to an end, that were completely auxiliary,
Yeah.
and how they still mean a lot to me, and I care a lot about them. Like all of the members of the Everett family, I care a lot about them. I care a lot about Deborah's father, Bo. I care a lot about her brothers. I care a lot about Wally, Miss Pearlson. These are minor characters, and I'm like, why do I care about these people? But I do, and so that surprised me. I was often surprised by things I learned through my research that I had to conduct, like biographical facts I learned about St. Martin. When I had the scene of the family eating pokeweed, I'm from North Carolina. I don't believe we have pokeweed here. But I knew that people in Alabama ate it, and I was very intrigued by this because it just seemed like it had a lot of metaphorical implications that this plant was poisonous, but you render it edible.
Right, by boiling it 3 times.
Yeah. So surprising things I learned over the course of my research like that. I was surprised by how Ham fell in with his buddies that he was working with in the kitchen, that he took the truck with and started traveling across the South working on farms, because that was a surprising. His interactions with them were very surprising to me, and I'm kind of like him in this way, in the sense that, like, and I've talked about not fitting in or not belonging or whatever, but in the sense that, like, I can kind of slip in culturally different places and kind of be like slipping in above the water, because when I was in Morocco on my Fulbright, I was very much slipping in and slipping out, and like down with what people were doing over there, and like and I think you would not suspect that a young black man from New Orleans becomes cool with these Latin American migrant workers, but he tries to learn Spanish, and he gains proficiency in Spanish, and some of how that evolved when he fell in with them was very pleasing and surprising to me.
Okay. Thank you. We're going to ask the audience if they have any questions for Chantal.
I have a question. I enjoyed your book. I read it at least a year ago, so some of the questions that you asked reminded me of the storylines. And one of the questions you asked about the book being a coming-of-age story for a young black man. And, you know, most people, at least, I'm not a writer, but you tend to write about things you know. Why did you decide to write a coming-of-age story with a young black man as a character versus a young black woman?
Well, I like your question a lot. I think that's a really great question. And it's really interesting because I'm going to say this about myself. I don't know women writers who are writing men like I'm writing men. Because in my book I wrote before this that's not yet published, I had a couple male protagonists who were dueling, telling that story, and they were dudes. They were like dudes. And so is Ham. And I just finished another novel that is about a man and men. And I think it's like just this weird way of me grappling with masculinity and getting my head around what does it mean to be a man. And I don't know why that's my preoccupation, and I'm trying to challenge myself to write more about women, to be honest with you. But I think writers don't always know why they are drawn to these things in particular, and this is something I don't know why, but it's like a thing that I'm doing is like telling men's stories, and I don't have a rational reason to tell you as to why I'm attracted to doing that, but I think it's just because to me masculinity is so interesting and just so complex and it's just very much something worth thinking about in a complicated way, because it has the powers of destruction, it has the powers of creation, and my men that I write are not like Ubermensch type.
Yeah.
They're like very complicated, vulnerable type of men. So I don't know why, but I'm attracted to exploring what masculinity is through my fiction, and for some weird reason, I don't know what it is. I can't tell you why, but that's my best answer. And I can tell you that this is not the first time I've tried to do it. So I know it's a thing.
So I have a question. Great job, actually, talking about this. I can imagine that when you're writing and you're in the process, you hit some challenges. And I'm curious as to how you then turn that into opportunity to get through it.
That's interesting. I think that the one thing I can say to that is that, first of all, if you're speaking about challenges in the creative process, this is where I think you often find as a writer, that's how you find out where the work is wiser than you and where the work knows things that you don't know. Because you come into a problem and it turns out the way to solve it is the way it was always supposed to be, that you were just being led to. And I'm sure you identify with that as a scholar. Yeah. And of course, I had a lot of challenges over the course of trying to publish it, times when I didn't think it was ever going to be published. And I did give up hope at several points on my journey, but I picked my hope back up again eventually. And the way I got through those challenges over the publication journey was just saying, at the end of the day, I just believe in the story I told. And I believe that it's going to find its way, because I believe that I believe in the story that I've told. I believe in my training as a writer, that I told my story with competence in my craft. And I believe that I'm as good enough as anybody who's out there. So I'm going to do my best to make it possible for myself. And that was what kept me going. I'm like Ham. One person believed in Ham, and she became his whole life. One person had to tell me to keep going. One person had to tell me to keep going for me to latch onto that and give me hope and give me strength to continue on.
Yeah.
You know, I actually saw something today on LinkedIn that spoke just to what you just said. And I see a lot more books in your future.
Thanks. I hope you have a crystal ball.
Any other questions or comments?
I just wanted to know what made you choose to go with a publishing company rather than self-publish. I know it's been a big journey.
For me, it was about the platform that I would be able to have and the legitimacy that I would be able to have. And I don't want to knock the self-publishing process whatsoever, because I respect people who are doing that a lot. But for me, when you self-publish stuff, you have to... For me, the collaboration of a publisher was necessary. When you self-publish stuff, you have to market your stuff. You have to figure out how to get it into stores.
You got to copy edit it yourself.
Oh yes, oh yes, and there are massive fails at that.
Right.
And I don't know how to choose a cover image, but because I had a publisher, they knew how to choose a cover image. And for me, I'm a young disabled black woman. I feel like I'm gonna take all the legitimacy I can get to be taken as seriously as I can, because I have so many strikes against me. I'm going for what I can get so that people will say, hey, let's listen to this person and think she's worth paying attention to, you know?
Great question. Thank you. Any other questions? Well, Ms. James, thank you.
Professor Neal?
This has been an honor to talk with you.
Oh,
About
the honor is mine.
wonderful book.
The honor is mine.
Thank you.
The honor is really mine.
Thank you very much.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything.